Hello and welcome to episode 23 of the Rogue Health Economist. This week is Trauma Week, and we are going to be looking all week at how trauma affects health outcomes. We're going to be digging into the root causes of trauma and how it's being dealt with in healthcare now and ways that it should be being dealt with in healthcare. And it comes at clearly a very traumatic moment in human history and American history. And so I'm very excited to have to kick off this event, my friend from the UK, Alex Howard. Welcome, Alex.
Hi, James. Thank you for having me.
So when I set up this as Trauma Week, I think we organized this about 7 weeks ago, and obviously we were at that moment knee deep in COVID, which in itself is a very traumatic experience, I think, for everyone. One of the things that we had an interview last week with Ali Hoffman, who said ultimately that one of the most traumatic things about COVID is that there was no real position that felt safe. Like either there was this horrible virus that was killing people, or there was this kind of like worldwide hoax that was being perpetrated on people. And if you held either one of those positions or anywhere in between, you couldn't really have a safe experience with it. And that lack of safety leads to trauma, and that trauma, can have all kinds of detrimental effects. So, ultimately here we are 7 weeks later, and ultimately we're just a couple of white guys sharing our opinions, and so we have to just really make sure that that we're respecting what's going on in the world. But I think I know from what I know of your career, you do have some experience of working with communities of people that have not felt heard and have not felt listened to and have had a traumatic experience.
Yeah, it's interesting, James, that we were just saying before we went live that it feels like we can't talk about trauma without talking about what's happening, particularly in America, but also there's been ripples in the UK over the weekend as well. But also, exactly as you said, feeling very sensitive to being two, relatively privileged white guys trying to have a conversation about this. And I was just saying to you that I realized that sort of part of my gateway into this is I've done a lot of work over the last 17 or so years with people with chronic illnesses, particularly chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, ME, that sort of kind of group of conditions. One of the things that people will say almost, I think, on a daily basis in my clinical work is people don't understand the experience that I'm having. And actually, worse than that, people think they understand the experience I'm having, but actually they don't. And an example of that will be is someone will say to someone suffering from, let's say, ME chronic fatigue, who's got the sort of devastating fatigue where just getting from, the bedroom to the bathroom feels like climbing a mountain. And they'll say, oh yeah, God, we all get tired, don't we? Or they'll say, so I remember when I had chronic fatigue as a teenager, and I remember I'd been off school for 3 months and I came back in, and it was like an enormous challenge just to try and do a 1-hour lesson. And I just started the school just around the time I first got sick. Someone said to me, oh my God, that sounds great. You get to lie in bed and watch TV all day. And I remember that sense of alienation, of anger, of frustration. And I think it's a very deep wound, not feeling seen and not feeling honest. Before we get into, which maybe we'll get into a little bit, some of the horrific things that have happened in history, before we even get into the actual things that have happened to people which are in marginalized groups, then the effect of not being understood and not being seen in that, I think, is deeply traumatic. And I remember a very, very good friend of mine who's gay, and there were 3 of us out having dinner, and we were discussing a business project. And the other guy that was with us is a quite well-known yoga teacher, very sweet, lovely, kind-hearted guy. And we're having this conversation, and he was telling us a little bit about his history of becoming a yoga teacher. And he says, and everyone thinks when you're trained to be a yoga teacher, you're just a puff. And he meant it in a completely non-offensive way. He was just having a conversation as guys have a conversation. And this friend of mine, and credit to him to being able to say something in the moment, was like, I actually find that really offensive, actually. And I don't think this other guy knew this guy was gay, but that shouldn't have mattered. But it was the kind of easy, seemingly harmless things that are said in day-to-day dialogue and conversation that can show the lack of awareness and understanding. So I think it's just an important frame as we're talking about this topic, that we're talking about it from a point of view of, I could say, I've got many friends of color. I feel like I understand some of the challenges they have, but truthfully, I recognize that I don't. That doesn't mean we can't understand trauma and we can't understand the impact of what it's like to be marginalized or to be judged. But I think it's just an important point for everyone to remember.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I echo that as well. But I do think that helping to understand, the biological mechanism. So in that example you just gave, something's happening at a physiological level that's, during that stress response that's happening. And maybe that's just a way that we can start, because ultimately, whether you are black or whether you're white or whatever race you are, the physiological responses that happen inside the body are the same in different ways. And so I think we should get into that, because ultimately, that's really, I know what your upcoming conference is about, and there's all different aspects to trauma. So when one goes through, I guess let's just start right at the beginning. Like, how do traumatic experiences affect us physiologically?
Well, I think Dr. Stephen Porges and his work on polyvagal theory, I think, is a really important and really helpful lens to understand this. And he's one of the people, kind of one of my, I guess, heroes in this space that I was one of the great things about running conferences is you get to interview all the people that you're interested in interviewing and ask all the questions you want to ask.
Tell me
and I think from polyvagal theory, there's a really helpful way of understanding it, that really there's three primary states that our nervous system can be in. There's a state of safe and social, and that's the state where, it's kind of as it sounds, we feel safe and we feel able to be social, to be open, to be able to express ourselves, hopefully in vulnerable ways. Our nervous system is relaxed, and that means that, the rest and digest state would be another way of talking about it. And in that state, we will sleep well, so we'll rest well, we'll digest food well. Sometimes it doesn't take much to trigger us from a safe and social state to the next state in terms of activation, which is the fight or flight state. And in fight or flight, it's a little bit like, you and I are out hunting saber-toothed tigers back in caveman days, and suddenly we get a bit too big for our boots and the saber-toothed tiger's coming after us. And in that moment, we need to escape. And so we need to get the blood supply to go to our arms and our legs, and digesting the woolly mammoth we had for lunch becomes unimportant. So we're either just going to expel what's in our digestive system, or we're going to get constipated and hold on. And we need to be primed for action. So in the fight or flight state, our body gets a hit of adrenaline, of cortisol, and it's designed to be a temporary state that our system goes into literally for physiological survival. And I think most people, when they hear about a stress response, they're probably fairly familiar with the idea of what I would call a healing state or a stress state, a safe and social or fight or flight. But I think particularly important in Dr. Stephen Porges' work, also Dr. Peter Levine's work, is the point that there's a state of even greater stress than fight or flight. And that's a free state or a shutdown state. And that's where, if you and I are running away from the saber-toothed tiger, we may be so paralyzed by fear that we simply can't move. And there may actually be a physiological benefit to that. It may be that if we just pretend we're really still, it may be the saber-toothed tiger hasn't seen us. Or it may be that we feign death. We pretend that we're actually already dead on the floor and we're no longer a threat. That's actually a state of parasympathetic overactivation or shutdown. People often hear about the sympathetic nervous system and the sort of being in that fight or flight. But that state of parasympathetic shutdown is almost where trauma is being held in the body. And actually, I think something that's very, very interesting when you look at animals in nature, that one of the things that happens when an animal goes into a free state is it doesn't get to process and digest the trauma. So normally when we run away, what we're doing is we're burning off all of that nervous energy that's held in the system. When we go into a shutdown, all of that energy is trapped and it's contained. And that's why when you see animals, when they go into shock, or when effectively they come out of the initial trauma state, you see them shake. Their whole body will actually shake as a way It's a healthy processing of the trauma response. Now, when we experience trauma as human beings, it's not so much the events that happen to, I mean, of course, the events are important, but the way that we respond to those events, and particularly when we're young children, the way that the people around to us respond to those events is really what determines whether something is going to be traumatic or not. So take an example. Let's say, you know, we're at school and let's say we got bullied by some kids at school, and we come home and we're really upset, and that there's trauma. Maybe we were physiologically afraid, like we were getting the threat of kind of being beaten up. But probably even more painful than that was the psycho-emotional trauma of, I'm not loved, I'm being rejected by the tribe, I'm never going to be able to come to school again, I don't feel safe. So we come home and all of this is in our body. How our parents or primary caregivers, how they respond to us in that moment is a major factor in whether we're traumatized or not. If their response is to allow us to have the feelings, like that animal in nature, to be able to shake and to sort of go into that kind of releasing kind of trauma response. In humans, that might mean crying, that might be being sad, being allowed to have our feelings, being comforted, a kind of feeling of emotional safety. It might not fix that issue of being bullied at school, that may require a different kind of resolution. But what we're taught is my feelings are okay. What we're taught is that ultimately I'm loved and I'm safe. But if we're responding, and particularly men may be responded to in this way, and that's not to say that men have a worse deal with just different cultural stereotypes, but particularly if we're told things like, big boys don't cry, or, you know, why didn't you stand up for yourself? Or we're shamed and rejected for the way that we responded, the way that we behaved. That trauma doesn't get released. It gets held in our body. But actually, in some ways, even more impactful than that is we learn something about ourselves and we learn something about the world. Maybe we learn the world is not a safe place. Maybe we learn that I'm not lovable. Maybe we learn that I don't have what it takes to protect myself and take care of myself. So trauma is not just what happens to us when we're a child. Trauma is how we've learned to respond and how we've learned to kind of embed that in our psyche for the rest of our life. And this sets up our beliefs, our habits, our behaviors. So the traumas that happen to us have an enormous impact on our physiology, but they don't just impact our body and how that's held in our body. They impact the shaping of our personality and ourselves. And for example, things like being an overachiever, we define our self-worth by what we do and what we achieve. Or being a helper, defining our self-worth by what we do and give to others. Trauma doesn't just impact our body, it impacts our behaviors. And then we become the architect of our own trauma in our life because we perpetuate and we recycle those habits and behaviors. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think that separation, it's not just what happens to the body, it's what we learn and the habits that come from that I think are also really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I want to just share my own experience in the last 6 months of being part of a men's group and really starting to open up to some of these conversations, you know, in my own experience and then witnessing other men going through the process, you know, seemingly small things in childhood or in, you know, in any time before can have a really, you know, detrimental effect. And I certainly saw how, you know, things that had happened in my childhood were leading to certain behaviors that I was not really conscious of. And it was actually, you know, fairly self-destructive. And, you know, and I don't consider myself having that traumatic of a childhood. There are certainly some traumatic elements, but nothing compared to, you know, many, I'm sure most people in the world had more traumatic experiences than I do, but I see how deeply it affected me and what behaviors I dragged along with me for almost 30 years. And
I think, sorry to interrupt you, but I think that's a really important point. One of the things, and it was a kind of there are certain themes that come out of, you know, you interview between us, Nick and I interviewed 90 people as part of this conference. And there's sort of one overwhelming theme that came out in many, many interviews, which is that we all have trauma. And yes, there's trauma with a big T, you know, those big, you know, things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, being in a war zone, those things that are undeniably, clearly kind of PTSD level sort of traumatic. But we all have had micro traumas. We've all had trauma with a small t. Those things like, it sounds like you're describing, those sort of things that would be easily forgotten and not thought about, but actually can have an enormous impact in shaping who we become for the rest of our life.
Yeah, and we don't typically have structures for examining it.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
so, like, I guess I want to get into it just to set up the week. I mean, look, the show is called The Rogue Health Economist, right? And ultimately, what I'm all about is trying to work out a way to reduce the costs of healthcare. Ultimately, we're on this upward trajectory in the UK where you are, where in the US where I am, and ultimately this is all going through the roof. And obviously, a lot of these, I guess if that cost trajectory has been driven by chronic illness, what role does trauma have in the in what role does trauma have in facilitating chronic illness and continuing chronic illness?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think trauma. Look, well, firstly, what I think I should say is that I don't think chronic illness is ever down to one factor, and I always get a little bit reactive when people kind of go, this is the one thing which is the source of all of this condition. Of course it's more complicated, but trauma, and I know you're talking with Nikki Gratrix, who co-hosted the conference with me. I'm sure she'll talk to you about the adverse childhood event studies, the ACEs studies, and she's gone quite deep into all the research and the data around that. But certainly what I'll say is that from my experience working for 17 or so years with chronic illnesses, that in almost every case, there is either a role of trauma as a factor in causing someone to get sick, but even if it's not there as a factor in causing one to get sick, the very experience of suffering from a chronic health condition is in itself traumatic, particularly when it's in the category of what we might call medically unexplained illnesses, conditions that are not well understood by traditional mainstream medicine. I remember when I was diagnosed when I was 16 years old with chronic fatigue syndrome, and it was like being given a life sentence, really, because I'm told you've got this completely debilitating illness that at least at that point there was some recognition that it was real. If I'd gone to a less, it's funny in hindsight to be grateful for the doctor, because at the time I really hated him, but I was lucky to have a doctor that even understood what that is. There are still many doctors even now that don't. If I'd seen perhaps that doctor 5-10 years earlier, it would have been, you must be making this up, there's nothing wrong with you. But a diagnosis of a chronic illness and the very experience of living with it is inherently traumatic. And actually something that I should say, the Optimum Health Clinic, which I founded, which is now quite a large charity in the UK, we about 3 or 4 years ago, we were kind of asking a similar question around actually what does ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, what is that costing the UK economy every year? Like, not just through paying for people to be ill in terms of healthcare, because actually that's quite a low cost because there's not much offered in terms of intervention, but lost tax revenue, having to pay benefits to people that are unable to work. Even things like absenteeism or even presenteeism of people who are unable to properly perform their jobs. Part of our thinking was, if we could make the economic argument that the British government would realize that not dealing with chronic illness is actually more expensive than investing money into interventions. And so we hired a think tank, and they did a series of research around contacting through freedom of information requests, contacting local authorities, contacting a whole bunch of different places. And the finding was, a low estimate of the cost of chronic fatigue syndrome to the UK economy is £3.3 billion a year. So about $4 billion a year. And that's just the UK. We imagine that the US is something like 5 times the size in terms of population. So these chronic conditions where trauma is a significant element, they have an enormous cost. And the cost of not dealing with that also perpetuates the cycle of these things more and more.
Yeah, that's absolutely huge. There's so many ways that I could take the conversation here now, because I think we've identified what a big problem is. Ultimately, one of the things that I spoke about and what I'm involved in now is like, okay, what's the solution here? Because, ultimately, that throwing a lot more resources at everyone is an option and certainly needed, but also, there are limitations on the amount of professional help that everyone could get. And so I've been very interested in, just having this experience with my men's group, right? Zero cost to anyone, value to everyone. Like, I've been able to deal with some traumatic moments and become more aware of them and sort of more around that. But other people in the group have certainly had other health results as a result of, being held accountable to their own goals for their own health. And here I see something that costs nothing to anyone, but is valuable to everyone. And ultimately, I guess, I'm in the sort of build the future solution kind of camp. And I guess I would just love to get your thoughts on, when you interview people for this conference, like, that I'm sure there's tons of information on how bad it is and how traumatized everyone is. And it just got a hell of a lot worse, right? Especially in America and with COVID around the world and so forth. So what do you see as ways that we can start to unwind this in ways that are going to be, cost effective so that it can reach the people who are probably affected most by it?
Well, I think the first thing is we have to name the problem. You can't solve an issue when it's in the shadows and it's being sort of ignored or forgotten about. And I think, that's part of what is important about what's happening right now is the issue of racism which has gone through certain waves of awareness, is right now front and center where it belongs on the cultural radar. And there's a dialogue and a conversation about that, or the beginnings, let's say, of hopefully of that. On the individual level, it's the same thing. You take the macro to the micro, you have to name, one has to be seen, one has to be validated in their experience. And you mentioned being in a men's group. One of the questions that I asked a number of the speakers is, how much of this can one do on their own? And how much of it depends upon community? Like, how much do you need other people to see and to witness and to hold one in one's experience? And one of the things, I don't remember who it was that said it, but it's a good analogy to compare it to things like the 12-step programs. So can someone get off drugs or alcohol on their own? Yeah, they can. And of course, people do. But is the success rate, I don't have the data on this, but is the success rate of someone doing that on their own anything like the success rate of someone doing that as part of a supported group program? I think it's fair to say it's not. And I think it's particularly true with something like trauma. If we go back to what I was saying about that safe and social state, part of that safe and social state is being held and being supported to be given, and sometimes it requires a therapist or a group or something external to give someone that sense of safety, that it's okay for me to relax right now. It's okay for me to actually start to slow down, to actually start to feel my feelings and emotions. And one of the things that we tend to learn to do in response to trauma is we go into our mind as a way of escaping our feelings. We do that by avoiding and distracting, by just being busy and having stuff to do all the time. Or we deal with it by state changing, using things like drugs or alcohol, whatever it may be. Or we deal with it by analyzing it. We become an expert in analyzing all the elements of our experience, but we're not actually feeling what's happening in our experience. In fact, one of the free gifts on the Trauma Super Conference, one of the registration gifts, I did a 1-hour session on emotional styles. It was just sort of 3 of the emotional styles of the ways that we deal with and respond to, or in a sense, don't deal with and respond to our feelings and emotions. And so when it comes to starting to heal trauma, we often need support. That can be online groups, that can be in-person groups, that can be family, that can sometimes be as simple. Sometimes I remember working with a patient a year or so ago, being for something really traumatic. And I realized this thing had happened a few weeks previously. And I realized I was the first person that she told this had happened to her. And her first step, before we're getting into processing it and therapeutic intervention and all of that, was, who do you trust that you can go and talk to about this and tell? Just to begin that process of taking this thing that there's shame about and bringing it out and starting to have that holding, and going back to what I was saying again around those states of the nervous system, the safe and social, the fight or flight and the freeze response, that part of what helps us come into that safe and social is that reassuring, like looking out at someone or people and seeing, I'm okay.
Yeah.
They're looking at me in a way that lets me know that my body can relax, my nervous system can relax. And I imagine, James, that's part of what you found from being in a men's group, that you can talk about something that feels, perhaps there's shame about it, feels really vulnerable, and your mind's telling you, I'm going to be rejected, I'm going to be laughed at, but then you speak it and the opposite happens.
Yeah, there's a few things I want to say to that, and I resonated with a lot of what you said. Yeah, so first, you know, the meeting is structured in a way to create safety and grow safety. So by the time at the end of the meeting that the most, you know, vulnerable things are happening, safety, you know, container has been created and improved over the time, so that by the time you really get into the vulnerable work, you really do feel that, and there are like safeguards in place in case you don't. So that's the first thing I would say is the power of the container. And yes, certainly that's been a big part. But just to go back to what you said, I feel like if we want to try and unwind this, right, it's like, yes, certain group of people, if you think about it, concentric circles, certain group of people will be able to just do it by themselves. The next group of people probably just need one other person that they can talk to about it. Then for certain people, they're going to need a community of people to facilitate. And then a layer below that is probably like professional care. And ultimately, you know, one of the things that I'm really passionate about as an economist, as I see that list, is that we can't just send people into the care. And part of the reason why we always send people into the care is because a lot of the things that would have helped us unwind these kind of patterns traditionally would have been community. It would have been elders, and it would have been family members, and it would have been other sort of members of the tribe that were trusted as part of the overall container. But as we all live these hyper individual lives and community goes away and we're all isolated, suddenly now the only solution is like either markets, like go and pay for someone to help you, or government, go and get some care from the system. And ultimately that re-emergence of community is really what's needed. And that could be one-on-one, that could be a sponsor or an accountability buddy, you know, a friend. And then it could be a community. And I just, you know, Kelly Brogan gave me this great phrase, or you know, what she'd seen from her efforts to reverse, you know, to get people off benzodiazepines, which was nothing sends the signal of safety more quickly and more effectively than community. And so her model is really just this community model, because she had found that she didn't know anyone like that. And I guess the last thing that I want to say is, in my book, The Community Cure, you know, just with what's happening in the world today, with the race riots and the things that are happening, one very, very interesting subject, which I think is relevant, is this, you know, the Centering Pregnancy program, where, you know, largely African-American women who have the poorest birth outcomes in places like, you know, South Carolina and Mississippi. I mean, it's traumatic to give birth in those societies where there's not much medical care, and there's a history of like preterm birth and kids dying and infant mortality numbers. And so, you know, as a mother, you're probably really scared that that's going to happen to you, because you don't have the kind of support that you need. And certainly you don't have the community. It's like evolutionarily new to give birth in, you know, in isolation and not having a community of other women around you. So here comes Centering Pregnancy, and all it does is really put these women in groups and have them share their own experience. And it's easy to find what group to be in, because the baby's going to be born around the same time, and it's easy to find an affinity group. And, you know, preterm birth goes down by 35%. How could that even happen unless we've vastly underestimated the role that trauma and social stress plays on giving birth? And if we knew how important it was, and just by sort of creating community and creating that safety, it has those dramatic numbers, improvements in safety and therefore birth outcomes. It makes total sense if being an African-American woman and giving birth outside of community is unbelievably traumatic. And I think that the solution to this whole thing is community. But ultimately, how do we create enough safety for community to be created? And ultimately, that's going to be the big question moving forward.
And I think one of the challenges is when people are living in communities right now which are in deep conflict, where those communities are literally, as we broadcast this session, are literally burning. And I think one of the things that's particularly challenging, and I think it's particularly true in this sort of current kind of, I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but kind of era of kind of conflict in social media and news headlines. And I think we don't actually have to agree with our people that we disagree with to be able to build a sense of community. That we sort of think, well, everyone has to agree with me, and we get into this very tribal sort of, I'm right, you're wrong, and I have to win this sort of conflict. And one of the things that I've seen, particularly working with people having issues in relationships or with family, that they think the resolution is everyone has to agree with them. And then what people start to realize is actually the resolution is not that I need people to agree with me. The resolution is I need people to hear me and to see me. And if I feel genuinely seen and heard by you, but we don't find that we necessarily agree on the detail of something, we may well find we're not in conflict. We may just have a difference of opinion around something. And I think the difficulty is the kind of human nature, and I think this is a very primal thing, is when we feel attacked, we defend. And it's sort of like, and of course, the more emotionally drained and tired we get, the faster we get to defend when we get attacked. And so when we're trying to, and I'm talking more about individual trauma here, but I do think that there's, it's true in the macro in some ways as well, that when we're trying to heal things in our personal relationships, we're trying to heal things with perhaps family members that we feel wounded by or hurt by, that it's not about being right. And it's not about, initially at least, and it's not about getting them to agree with me and I'm going to attack you and fight you till you do. It's about how do you build enough safety in that container that both sides can feel heard and can feel seen. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that each opinion is equally valid. Like, you know, you look at the sort of race riots, and there's just certain things that are objectively true, whether people like it or not. It is objectively true that there has been a historical, many years racism, oppression, and there may be people that don't want to accept that, but that truth is still true nonetheless. But to be able to invite dialogue, yes, we have to own our truth and we have to come from a place of strength and we have to stand for what we believe. But certainly in my experience on the micro level is the more that we go from a point of view of shaming and attacking, the more we invite defensiveness and the more we perpetuate the cycle of trauma and suffering. And it's hard enough on the micro level to break that dynamic, and it's even more complicated on the macro level.
Absolutely. Well, look, this conference I don't think could have come at a better time, Alex, and I'm really excited for our community to check it out. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what's in store and the dates and the details?
Yeah, so this sort of started off towards the end of last year. I hosted the Fatigue Super Conference last year, and as I sort of mentioned earlier, I really liked having the opportunity to ask a series of people the questions that I wanted to ask them. And a lot of my work, I work as having created a methodology called therapeutic coaching, but a big part of my fascination is mind-body healing, and trauma is a big piece of that. And I was talking with Nikki Gratrix, who I know as a friend of yours, who co-founded the Optimum Health Clinic with me back in 2004. And we just started having conversations about this. And then it was sort of like, well, let's come up with a sort of, who's the dream list of people that we want to interview and talk to about this? And her and I, having been around the block for a few years, the list got quite big and got quite long quite quickly. So we've ended up with 90 of the world's leading experts on trauma, but I think trauma in the broadest definition of trauma. So not just, although including, but not just those sort of big T traumas, but the micro traumas and the impacts that we all experience in different places in our life, and looking at it from the point of view of top down. So trauma from the point of view of psycho-emotional impacting physiology, but also bottom up, how what happens in our body also impacts us on a psycho-emotional level. So we're also looking at things like gut health, looking at things like mold toxicity, because those things also become a source of trauma. So it's a series of interviews from the 29th of June to the 5th of July. So it's 7 days. And each day we've got a series of interviews. We also, what we did at last year's Fatigue Super Conference, and I really liked this, a lot of great feedback on this format, is trying to create the experience that you have when you go to an in-person conference. And you don't just have the sort of keynotes, but you have some other things that are happening as well. So we have daily meditation and yoga sessions, video sessions. So it's not just sort of theoretical, you're bringing it more into the body. We have a series of filmed sessions, so actually real life clinical sessions, working with people, healing trauma and working with their emotions. We have some more practitioner geared stuff around the methodology of therapeutic coaching, which has been a big part of my work over the years. It's completely free for people to join and access those sessions each day. People can also purchase access to the recordings if they want to. If people register now, there's some pretty, I think, epic registration gifts. So I think two of the best interviews of the conference, Dr. Gabor Mate, who is particularly well known for books like The Body Says No, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, some of the biggest best-selling books on trauma. Professor Bessel van der Kolk, whose book, The Body Keeps the Score, I think is one of the most important books also on trauma, both exceptional interviews. We also have some COVID-19 related bits and pieces. So Nick Ortner of the Tapping Solution does a session on tapping and EFT for working with COVID-19 impacts and health anxieties. Dr. Joseph McCullough talks about how to support immune function. So we're really coming at this topic from many, many different perspectives. But those sessions, particularly, people register now, they can get immediate access to those. And yeah, in terms of timing, this was pre-COVID-19, and when COVID started happening, it just felt all the more important, this dialogue. And then what's been evolving in the last week, it feels all the more important again. I don't think anyone's lives are not impacted by trauma in some way, and having more awareness, more strategies, more support around that, I think is super important.
Awesome. Yeah, so if you're listening to this, you can go to findfunctional.com/trauma. We'll put the links in the show notes for you to register and find out a little bit more. You can get all of those gifts ahead of time. And yeah, look, Alex, I really appreciate you going deep into this, and appreciate the opportunity to connect with your community as part of this session. And just really excited to be opening up this conversation. This week, we are going to, take the conversation into a number of areas. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about trauma-informed care with Masted Kipp, who I know is also on the summit. On Wednesday, with my friend Sayana, who's going to be talking about sort of what it takes to embody trauma recovery. And then on Thursday, I'll be speaking to Nikki about ACEs and adverse childhood events. And then on Friday, we're going to be just wrapping up this trauma week. But part of what I'm seeing, Alex, and sort of as my new organization with Find Functional, I see that functional medicine hasn't been all that trauma informed. And ultimately, doctors create their practices based on people not having trauma, like being able to follow through with protocols, and just their wisdom being the thing that transforms people from not doing what they know they shouldn't do that's unhealthy to suddenly doing it. And that's not working as far as I see. And I see that we do need to have a real conversation as to why do people not do why do people continue to do unhealthy behaviors in the face of new information? And I feel like trauma is a big component of that. And one of the things that we're looking to do at Find Functional is really create people who are ready for functional medicine care, ready to actually do healthy new behaviors and work through some of the lists that they already have in their own head of things that they know they're doing that's unhealthy. You don't need a new mold protocol if you're still drinking Diet Coke, right? We need to really determine why you're still drinking Diet Coke in an era where you understand what aspartame is and the effect that it has on you. That conversation really needs to happen. And I've been in functional medicine long enough to see that we're not really taking appropriate care to do the right things in the right order to maximize outcome at the minimum possible cost. And ultimately, if we want to bring access to this kind of care to people, we really need to start thinking in those ways.
Just to jump in, I know we're wrapping up, but just I think part of where this evolution understanding of trauma has also come from is that for many years in the sort of functional medicine, self-development, self-help, personal growth sort of field, let's say, there was a strong emphasis around things like positive thinking, changing state, shifting habits, behaviors. And that stuff has brought us a long way in many ways. There's some really valuable things that have come from that. But the truth is, it hasn't all delivered on the promises that we hoped would be true. That often what drives us as human beings is not the rational, it's the emotional. And those unresolved emotional wounds and impacts, which we could call traumas, have an enormous impact on shaping our habits and behaviors. That example of why is it that a super intelligent person who is able to drive themselves to work 16, 18 hours a day, make themselves go to the gym when they're totally exhausted, like it's got unbelievable willpower, can't stop drinking the Diet Coke. They don't lack willpower. They don't lack the ability to be determined around something, but they're being driven emotionally. And that's where I think that the evolution in the kind of psychotherapeutic world has particularly come in recent years. There's this realization that we can't just deal with the mind. We also have to understand emotions and feelings. And I think that there has been I think there's a sort of renaissance or a kind of a surge of awareness and understanding. And I think that we're in some ways in the early days of a very exciting era where trauma and feelings and emotions are going to become a big part of the work in this field. And I think we're going to see that approaches and protocols that have helped some but not others are going to become more effective as we start to deal with these underlying pieces, which are so important.
Well, maybe if there is one thing that British men are allowed to talk about is emotional repression.
I think we've definitely got the PhD in that.
And we have forefathers who have repressed a lot of emotion. So thank you so much for leading the charge, and excited to be part of the conference. And if you're watching this, check out findfunctional.com/trauma. Check it out. You can register, get all those gifts. I've been here with Alex Howard. This has been the Rogue Health Economist, episode 23. All this week, we are going to be talking about trauma, and I hope you can join us same time, same place tomorrow. In the meantime, thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.